Good afternoon and welcome back to our webinar series covering the Harvest 2022 Strategic Farm Trial results. This is the third webinar of the series and the final webinar will be next Wednesday at the same time. So today's webinar is focusing on tailoring crop inputs, bringing together the trial results from the Strategic Farm East and the Strategic Farm Scotland. So before we start, we've got a few housekeeping points. So other than speakers, all microphones are on mute and all cameras are off. There is a chat box on the right hand side of the screen where you can ask questions. This chat box is only seen by AHDB staff, so you can also put in there your basis and the rota information so that we can register you to collect points after the webinar. We're due to finish by 2 p.m. and this webinar is being recorded and will be available online afterwards. If this is the first Strategic Farm webinar that you're tuning into this year, the others are available online at the moment as well. And today's webinar will cover 3 trials across the Strategic Farm East and Scotland, looking at crop protection and nutrition. So firstly, we'll look at the Managed Low Inputs trial at the Strategic Farm East, which is hosted by Brian Barker, and then we'll move to Scotland with David Aglen and Steve Hoad to go through the nutrition trials there. Unfortunately, Brian is unable to join us today due to unforeseen circumstances, but he sent a brief overview of the reasoning behind the Managed Low Inputs trial. So the trial started when low price was driving lower cost structure. And now we're in a situation where high prices are increasing the risk, but more profit can be accumulated. So although it's another low disease pressure season, Brian said that the thought of growing a higher value crop did influence him to spend more than he potentially needed to. So this trial is continuing into Harvest 23, which is the 6th and final year of the Strategic Cereal Farm East programme. And the reasoning behind continuing the trial is as follows. So Brian said that we need to question every application and challenge our agronomists more. We need to be more reactive to weather and field conditions and understand our attitude to risk. So this trial has been running for a few years, and at the end of the project next year, there will be year-on-year data analysis. And the previous results can be found on the Strategic Farm East webpage for you to look at whenever it's convenient to you. So Will Smith at NIAB leads the trial, and he is now going to present this year's results. As always, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat box. We can go through them at the end, and I'll hand over to Will.
Good afternoon. Sorry, just going to minimise my view screen so I can see what I'm doing.
Have you got the GoToWebinar dashboard isn't visible to us, so you should be able to carry it as
we're all gone. We're all ready. Thank you, Christian. Good. Yes. So good afternoon. I'm Will Smith. So I'm one of the researchers at NIAB, and I've been looking after and monitoring this Managing Low Inputs trial that we've had at Brian's farm, as Fiona said, the 2nd year. So hopefully a familiar setup for those who have tuned in before, but I will just go over that briefly shortly. But firstly, I just wanted to give a little bit of background as to where we got to and why we got to this point and why we got to this trial. So previous work on Brian's as a monitor farm and then subsequently actually in the first year or two as a strategic farm was really focused on variety interactions and that interaction with the fungicide input levels. So they're very similar field scale trials with 4 or 5 different varieties with these similar low and high fungicide input levels. And this really narrowed down Brian to a suite of varieties that really would work well in these lower input systems, those with high ratings on the AHDB recommended list for disease resistance, but also other characteristics that worked well for his system. And really, this is the first step in reducing inputs, certainly for me, and I'll talk about that later. It's really about giving yourself the opportunity to reduce inputs. And variety choice is one of those first steps that you can make. It's the first step at the beginning of the season. It's the first step in managing these inputs. So in terms of a trial outline, I say this is hopefully beginning to become familiar to regular viewers of these webinars. But we have again gone for a field scale pot trial. So we've got plots on this year. They were 30 meters by 75 meters, and it's replicated twice across the field with this following treatment list. So we've got 2 input levels, a low and a high, which incorporates fungicides, but it also incorporates some additional spend on biostimulant and micronutrition products as well, to try and within this concept of lowered inputs, not just looking at fungicides, but also some of these alternative tools that we've got in our box. And then we've also got the application timings. Now, rather than just looking at a standard program as a whole, as some of the previous work has done, again at Brian's, but also elsewhere, we really wanted to break down these different timings that are used throughout the season for fungicides, so that we can break down and look at them in isolation and in combination. So we've got plots that had just a T1, just a T2, or just a T3. And then we had plots with all of those combinations. So as you see, the T1 and the T2, but leaving out the T3, dropping the T2 and dropping the T1. And then we've got the plot with the entire program throughout. There's no interaction between low and high. So if it received the low at T1, it would have received the low at T2, and etc. And ditto for the high. Everything was applied by the farm, so through a farm commercial operator sprayer. So we don't have, this isn't small plot work. This is real on-farm trials. So as I said about the variety and the drilling date, I've said Graham as a variety, really strong variety resistance perspective in terms of what it adds, was our starting point. And the drilling is, it's not super early, but for Suffolk and after a number of wetter autumns, this is a perfectly adequate drilling date, the 24th of September, and certainly fits in and around Brian's previous history in terms of when he's been drilling these practices on the later end of his farm. So what does that treatment list actually look like? What were the products used? What were those rates? So T0, the entire field, certainly the trial part included except for the untreated, received a micronutrition biostimulant type mix with this Exotop, Yaravita, Gramitrel, and the Maxfi SRUC. That was very much a blanket application to help with other parts, and that's very standard for Brian across the farm. And the T1, we had at the low level, we had Affix, and then at high, Ascarex Pro, again, premium product, reasonable dose rate of that. But applied at a sensible timing, 3rd of May, as expected, very tight on these growth stages as to when the actual growth stage was. Then at T2, Alatus era, again, sort of maybe slightly, still fairly premium product, but previous generation compared to the newest sort of kid on the block, one of the newest kids on the block from the Revistar stable with Veridor XE. And then at T3, we had the Azoxystar, and it was Oxystrobin straight at the low, and at the high, we've tuned this from what we learned last year, and Brian has upped this really quite a lot, so that we've got Turbazan in there as a tebuconazole product, and then Firefly as well, which is so the tebuconazole was actually addition to what we used last year, the Firefly. So is this an iterative trial? We've tried to put the learnings of previous years into this year. In terms of overall costs, and we will talk about that a little bit later, but actually our low this year was lower than last year as a cost point, but our higher was actually quite a lot higher than last year's as a low to high comparison. I note that because we'll refer back to last year's results shortly. So what was the year like? And I think it's really important to absolutely caveat with all these results, where this is the weather conditions at Brian's, and what we've seen this year is incredibly important for the results forthcoming. So rainfall, I think everyone can very much agree, this was an incredibly dry year, but it wasn't just the spring that was dry, throughout the autumn as well. Actually, overall it was either dry or on average. So in the first column of this slide, the red points are the long-term average. That's over 10 years of average data for rainfall, and then the blue bars are what we had in the growing season, 2021 to 2022. So in pretty much all of those years, apart from say October, was about on average. December and February were either just under or just over, but all of those years were significantly lower than the long-term average. And in particular, June and July were really poor years in terms of water availability, and this has had a significant impact on the disease level. But interestingly, not the overall yield, which again an interesting discussion point. In terms of the temperatures, if you take it as a mean average, it was actually a reasonably normal year. However, the detail is really where we learn things, and the maximum, which is the middle graph, and the minimums, which is the far right. Again, red points are the long-term average, and the blue bars are last year's. And in last year, we had generally higher than average maximum temperatures and lower than average minimum temperatures. We've got a wider range of temperatures that are experiencing, both on a day-to-day basis, but throughout the month. And that's really different sort of conditions to deal with, where we've got these daytime swings of, on some days we had a swing of almost 20 degrees from the nighttime to the daytime temperature, which is incredibly rare up till now for the UK and certainly for Suffolk in isolation. So really different conditions that we're dealing with this season that has just gone. And when I say about the conditions are not conducive to disease, in no plot at any point, including the untreated, which is the photo on the screen, did we record any disease over 5% on any leaf layer. So that is the untreated shortly before the T2 application, correct, and incredibly clean looking crop for this year. So there was no significant differences across the disease identified at any point during the season, which in itself is frustrating from a trial that you're trying to observe disease in, but it's incredibly telling as to our messages around inspecting crops and using that to determine what we do next. So in terms of the results, so there's very little to show from the actual crop disease itself. But from the crop yield perspective, and firstly, I'll just add a little bit of context to these figures that are in this table. This was a crop of winter wheat after oilseed rape, and for last year's harvest, the range on Brian's farm for that slot, for that rotational slot, was between 10.4 and 11.6 tonnes per hectare from his combine, and this field was the absolute definition, the average of that. The field average from Brian's yield data was 10.9, banging the average, and this was actually higher than Brian's long-term average for some of the work that colleague David Clark's been looking at. The long-term average for this rotation slot going back for the sort of last 5 or 6 years. So this was actually a really good year from a yield perspective at Brian's farm, despite the dry conditions and those rain and that fluctuation in temperature. We've ended up with a really good, really strong yielding crop. So the untreated was doing nearly 11 tonnes a hectare, and then a few differences within that table. If we sort of combine some of these factors in terms of the yield, this is the combined average yield for both the untreated, the low inputs, and the high, so completely irrespective of the secondary factor of timing. And although the low and the high, they did produce significantly higher yields when you pull it across that factor. There is no significant difference between them. So that's very important when we consider the margin and how we treat our crops going forwards. Say fungicide response is incredibly important in this context, and obviously the limited amount of disease that we had has resulted in incredibly low yield responses, which is somewhat expected. Although despite that we have got some yield response, so there are obviously some non-fungicidal properties of fungicides that are moderately increasing our yield potential in our crops. As I said, they were significant over the untreated, but no significant difference between the two. So this graph is the pooled average of the increase above either the untreated or the difference between the combinations. So, for example, the T1, this is the yield response of the T1 alone over the untreated, but it's also the difference between the T1, T2, T3 treatment when you drop out when you drop out the T1. So sort of effectively the benefit that's given that program. So there's an average in there, but across both input levels between 0.2 and 0.3 tons per hectare was the average yield response. And the T1, the T2 is incredibly small, and is often sort of the reverse of how we perceive our fungicide control and our disease control. This is targeting the flag leaf, the most important leaf, or one of the most important leaves certainly for crop development, and the timing associated with controlling this, controlling disease on this leaf, brought us the lowest yield response of barely 0.1 tons a hectare, irrespective of program intensity. And for the second year running, the T3 has given us a disproportionately large yield response. So last year, although it was dry, it wasn't dry in quite the same way. It wasn't as dry, it wasn't as extremely dry. We still had this overall dry. So this is now comparing the 2 years. So 2021, we didn't have that moisture limitation. We did have a reasonable level of disease, and the yield response was about twice that of this year. And again, T3 giving a disproportionately high return on investment. Obviously, where we've had even drier times in 2022, that investment overall, so that return overall is far better out of the program. But really, this is coming back to looking at our crops properly. In 2022, if we were going out and looking at the crops, either T1 or T2 stage, there's a very strong argument. There was no disease to control. Looking at the forecast ahead, the weather was very settled in this dry, reasonably warm temperatures. So conditions not conducive to disease proliferation through the crop. And there's some argument that even the low was unnecessary. When we talk about that, that's not just from a disease perspective, but also from a margin. So we've looked at the margin in this trial across 2 crop prices. So this is firstly a lower crop price of £160 a tonne, again for winter wheat, as a longer term average, or certainly of recent times as an average, discounted the fact that crop prices peaked last year. But if we look at it at this £160 tonne figure, the green bars are the high inputs, or high program inputs, and the blue bars are our lowest inputs. And again, we've got this got a laser spotlight slide. We've got a sorry, apologies. Drag that screen. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. So we've got this low T3, low T1 programs were delivering the highest margin relative to the untreated. However, overall, the average for this is dead zero. So if you picked a random strategy out of all of these, chances are you'd have had a zero return on your gross margin over your untreated. This only incorporates the price of the products themselves, so it has no cost of input or cost of application rather. And if you're budgeting on a rough cost of £15 a hectare per application, which is somewhere around the average for the industry, then a lot of these that are positive would actually turn into negatives quite quickly. So you'd be left with probably just the low T3 and low T1 and T3 programs actually being more profitable than our untreated crops. How does that change if we were going to be using a much higher input crop price, which obviously, as we know, that peaked last season. So looking at prices, it was possible to go and sell your wheat on some markets at about £320 a tonne if you're a little bit quick, but that's sort of roughly where the market peaked. If we look at that as a difference, so this is a slightly different setup graph, but it's the same information in terms of gross margin relative to the untreated. Obviously, if you have a higher crop price, everything increases. Most of those programs then became positive in terms of relative to the untreated, as obviously, but the order of the preference all stayed the same. It all moved up linearly because of the price at the top feeding down was obviously going to have a strong margin. Really, the message here is if you really split it between your low input and high input, and therefore, if you have a higher crop price, therefore you may be thinking that this justifies, or you might consider justifying a higher input as some sort of insurance. You've got more value in the field, and therefore you might require, you can try to plan to put more input on in case things turn out differently, and you need to protect that crop. In this season, actually, the low inputs in the majority of cases over these programs were more profitable than our higher inputs, and therefore we can actually begin to detach, certainly in these really dry, very extreme conditions in this year, we'll begin to detach the idea that we are using fungicides as an absolute relation to crop price. We need to consider these factors. So crop health is unrelated to crop price in terms of how we consider how looking after our crop. We always need to be trying to protect our crops to the best capabilities. And if we don't need to be putting on fungicides because there is no disease about this, we're looking at use decision support tools or what other mechanisms you use, then potentially you need to use that opportunity to cut back. Because actually when we have these higher prices, that's the time to really make the most of having these lower inputs, because then our overall margin, it becomes more exaggerated. If we just say, okay, there's a higher crop price, well, I'll put more crop on, your margin is staying far more even, dependent on crop price. Different people look at their businesses differently, but certainly there's a very much a strong argument to try to begin to de-link some of these, certainly in our minds around when we talk about crop protection. It isn't linked to crop price at all. The disease doesn't know what the crop price is doing. So we need to think of those quite independently of each other. So as a summary, minimising inputs really requires the right opportunity. And that is in the last two seasons of this trial. And as Fiona said, we will continue with this next year, and we hope for some slightly different conditions to pull out some different messages around this. We've had two. Last year was very low disease year, and the year before didn't have a huge amount more disease, and therefore the messaging around when we handle our inputs is quite easy. There's no disease, we have an opportunity. What does that look like in a different year when we've got conditions that are causing septura to explode through the crop, and then yellow rust is then coming in and brown rust coming in later in the season? We have to deal with these challenges. In those conditions, what does minimising inputs look like? And that's will be really interesting to hopefully track that through to this third season. But of course, we need to always start with these good IPM principles. And when we're talking about disease management, the two that really come to mind have got to be variety and of course drilling date as well. It's not just for blackgrass control or other grass weed control. It is also for disease control, and these later drill crops do help to reduce the overwintered disease in the overwintered crop, and therefore the disease proliferation later in the spring. So if we start with that good strong base, then we are creating opportunity in which we can minimise our inputs. And finally, I think it's really potential debate, but certainly this input use, we can and certainly potentially should be trying to detach it a little bit from the crop price and really focusing on the crop. Going out, as Fiona mentioned, Brian really wants us to note that we want to challenge our crop advisors on what is happening on the farm, what is and why we are applying what we're applying, and that's absolutely correct. And therefore, but that should be independent of our final sale price. We need to be creating the best crop possible, most productive crop possible, and then the crop price follows from there. Anyway, that's me. So I think questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Will. I'll ask a couple of questions now, if that's all right, while it's fresh on people's minds. So yep. You mentioned that the temperature changed quite a lot between in each day. Did you notice that obviously the yield was then still really good? Did you notice any difference in the crop growth with those temperature swings?
No, not at all actually. No, I mean, so we were going out and visiting the crop. I was nearly weekly, but certainly in 2 weekly intervals throughout this time. And no, I didn't notice any adverse crop effects whatsoever. Obviously, yeah, the whole field was obviously, we're not there weren't treatments that we have expected to see any phytotoxicity or anything. But no, the crop looked absolutely fantastic. And I can say that because Brian's not on the call, so I'm not under any obligation. But the crop looked absolutely fantastic all season. Yeah.
So do you think that's kind of the tolerance is a variety trait, or did you see that kind of consistently across the region?
No, I don't think it's any specific variety. Certainly not that I'm aware of. And it seemed to be across the region that we had some fairly, really strong crops across our trial plots. NIAB has plots across the region, and I think that we saw a fairly similar results from trials run out of our Morley Centre that typically are in Norfolk and stuff as well. Maybe slightly towards the coast, we might have seen some greater effects, but no, generally speaking, this was certainly the trend that we saw across the region.
Crops seem to be a little bit more tolerant than maybe we thought they were. So moving on to the yield response, it looked like there was a higher yield response to low dose rates. Do you think that could mean that higher dose rates could be limiting yield?
No, I think there's just the differences between these are insignificant. So there's just a bit of noise around that data, around that data point. So they say that no timing factor was there a significant difference between the low and the high. So these are just yeah, as far as I'm concerned, this is just a bit of field variation and the noise within that.
That's great, thank you. So we'll move over to Scotland. If anybody does have any more questions for Will, he's going to stay with us until the end of the webinar. So please do continue to put the questions into the chat, and we can pick up with that after the Scotland presentation. So if we bring David onto the call. Hi, David.
Hello.
So we are going to be moving on to the Scotland trials, which are looking at amending nutrition instead of fungicides. So could you give us an overview of the reasoning behind these trials? Obviously, you work with a steering group, which decide what trials that we carry out over the strategic farm programme. So what was it that made you want to do these trials?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. We set about deciding on these trials because we kind of looked at the state of arable agriculture as it is, and in our mind, carrying on with using fungicides whilst they're easy to use, the options are diminishing quite rapidly. Fungicides aren't coming forward at the rate that we've been used to for the last 20 years or more, and their efficacy is waning quite rapidly. And indeed, I was hearing this morning that controlling septoria down in the south of England is becoming nigh on impossible, apparently. So there's been a lot of theory bandied about the last few years about the notion that a healthy plant can fight off disease itself. So we did a bit of looking into this, and we'd been tinkering on the farm for a year or two before we became a strategic farm. It seemed an ideal opportunity to investigate this in more detail. First off, we were trying to see whether we could connect Brix with disease levels in the plant. The theory being if the plant's healthy, it's got a high Brix level, which is the sugars in the plant sap. And that could be used to guide perhaps so whether we need to do anything more to the plant, or indeed if we can just keep the plant healthy, we could avoid the need for fungicides. This has proved challenging, but hopefully we're going to run the same trial. This is year 2, and another 4 years running the same trial through, so we can find some useful information, or maybe not. The other trial that Steve's going to talk about is the use of foliar urea as a nitrogen source on wheat crops in particular. Again, we've been trying this on the farm here for 2 or 3 years now, and the theory is that the nitrogen goes straight into the leaf in the form of urea, and you effectively get more bang for your buck. And when we started this, of course, it was about reducing carbon. It was about using less nitrogen fertilizer, also keeping a healthier plant by not overloading it with nitrogen as we do when we use standard practices of chucking a lot on at one go. And now it's become a bit more pertinent. Prices have shot through the roof, as we're all very aware. So we really do want to use less. And recently we've had the announcement from DEFRA that they want to use inhibitors on urea from 2024, I think. And one way around this, if you're not happy about using inhibitors, is to use foliar urea. That seems to be exempt at the minute, so I'm quite delighted with that. And on farm, we appear to be getting good results. So we will hand over to Steve and see what the trials actually made when they started measuring things in detail.
Great, thank you, David. Yeah, we'll hand over to Steve. If anyone's got any questions for David about the trials or about his farm practice, please do put them in the chat and we can cover those later. So over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Fiona and David. Is the screen looking okay?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
That's good. Okay, right. Well, so as David has just said, we'll focus today on two parts of the work at Balbirnie, and we will think about the two tramline trials that we want to keep going so that we can pick up sufficient data to give us confidence in any changes in agronomy that we might make. So today, what I plan to do is to introduce some common measures that we took across the two tramline trials, calling them the nitrogen application and the nutrient adjustment trials. And along with that, there were common ways that we looked at data, so looking at relationships between some of the crop measures and then final yield and grain nitrogen content and grain nitrogen offtake. So I'll focus on design of the work, then the common measurements that we made, and then the results in these sort of key sections. So the yields and yield mapping, the time course in some of the key crop measures, and linking measurements to yield, and then particular focus on bricks. And this is something we want to, a method we want to be able to test and put some numbers on the value of bricks in the analysis of crop health. So representing both nitrogen and nutrient trials, these suite of measurements, and I introduced many of these last year. So ground cover, leaf area index measurement, measurement of leaf chlorophyll or nitrogen estimate using a SPAD meter. Then that information was then used to work out what I call a crop nitrogen pool. So a composite of leaf area index and SPAD readings. We then took samples of leaves that went into nutrient analysis as well as SAP testing, and then also used a bricks meter, which is essentially a refractance, light refractance method that's quite commonly used in the fruit sector and the food sector for looking at sugar content in products. This is just a picture that's from last year's work, just as a snapshot really of how we were looking at the crop in the measurement zones. So the parts of the fields that we were taking measures, we could get information, capture it in this way, and then bring together into those key measurements that I outlined just above. Just on bricks, I've just got a few words here for you, so just to provide a bit more background. So as I say, it's quite a widely used measure, less so in arable crops. There's some interest in the grassland sector, I understand, but we want to really give this a thorough test during the life of our project. There are various ways of or gadgets for doing this that you can buy relatively cheaply. We've chosen to try to use perhaps a bit more of a top of the range device. And here's just an illustration of how leaf material is prepared and sort of ground to create some sap with a this is with a garlic crusher here. So it depends how strong you are to how much sap you can squeeze out of this preparation, and then using a pipette put onto the cell of the refractor to get the bricks reading. So on to the trial. So the first one then, the first part is the nitrogen trial. So here we had the tram lines replicated, so 3 treatments. So as David said, we were comparing here what we might regard as the standard ammonium nitrate application, and then 2 which were regarded as our adjusted treatments, one with ammonium nitrate followed by foliar applications, and then the farm adjusted 2 was the liquid urea, and then 6 following foliar applications. The total nitrogen was the same across all. So it's really looking at the efficiency of nitrogen use by the crop with the methods. This is an outline of the plan. You can see the standards, and then the outside the standard tram lines, there were one of the adjusted ones, and then the farm adjusted one on the outside. The reason for that design related to practicality of making the standard application, as you may well appreciate in these tram line style designs. But just developing that, here is the yield map. So going straight onto yield in the same orientation. So the thing to take away from this slide is that, well, you can see the tram lines from 1 to 6 from the right-hand side, but you can see here with the yield mapping, the higher yields tended to be in the northern part of the field. So these are the green and the grey coloration here, and you can see the main measurement zone was sort of about a third halfway into the field. So we could argue here that there was perhaps not adequate representation of the full tramline effect, and I'll come on to that when we get onto the results. So evidence of a significant gradient that emerged during the season. So on to the yield results now. So here I've just averaged the standard and the 2 adjusted treatments, and you can actually see for the full tram line, based on the results that David provided, although the yields look quite different between the standard and certainly adjusted one, the overall effect was not significant. So that there was sufficient variation to make this not non-significant. But when you can look at the measurement zone itself, here I actually estimated the yield from that sort of 100-meter zone based on the map that David provided. But you can see here that the yield was much more uniform in that zone, and that affected the relationship between the crop measurements made in this zone and yield. If we think of the offtakes here, so well, grain nitrogen concentration and nitrogen offtake here, so you can see that certainly for grain nitrogen concentration, the effect here of treatment was not significant, although that's quite a difference there between standard and adjusted. But overall, the effect that's not significant. Whereas in the grain offtake, the effect certainly was significant between both the adjusted and standard. So in this case, the standard offtake being relatively high to the other treatments. We'll do a more complete analysis of fertilizer use efficiency and nitrogen use efficiency at a later stage. This is now going on to the time course of the crop measures. So from early in spring, from leaf 3 up to flowering time. So the left-hand side, we've got the leaf area index, and you can see actually the adjusted treatments here looked pretty good in terms of their leaf canopy size compared to the standard treatment. So not a lot of difference there, apparently in the physiology of the plants of the different tram lines. In terms of the SPAD readings, so the leaf chlorophyll readings, there was no significant treatment effect here, but there was a difference when we look across the different timings. So across growth stages, as you can see, that the date effect was quite strong rather than the treatment effect being strong. In terms of the nitrogen pools, on the left-hand side here, certainly evidence that the adjusted plots were actually efficient in actually capturing the crop nitrogen, so a composite of leaf area and SPAD readings. So really we need to look into a bit more detail how this was converted into the way that the crop actually used nitrogen in the grain, and to look in more detail at the quality of that grain, just to see if we got any link between this trend and quality of yield. In terms of bricks units, certainly no significant difference between treatments, but certainly there was over the different timings. So you can see bricks varied from around about 10 to towards 20, and it varied at different timings. On terms of disease here, so again, this is just showing through time, and there was no evidence that the different nitrogen treatments impacted differently on the expression of disease. So this is Septoria tritici in 2 leaves in this case. The reason why we've got different size points here, or different blobs here, is because a lot of the points actually were in exactly the same position. So I've just reconfigured the sizes so you can see all the different treatments here. So if we're looking at relationships between crop measures and, in this case, yield, the left side is considering the tram line as the full tram line, and here it's leaf area index and yield in the measurement zone only. So you can see in the more representative parts of the field that relates to where the crop was sampled and measured, you can see that there is evidence of an association between leaf area index and grain yield, but not for the tram line as a whole. When we look at the SPAD readings and the nitrogen pool, again, it's a similar message here. It's about making measurements in representative parts of the field, because it's quite clear when we consider the measurement zone only, then the association between SPAD and nitrogen pool with yield is evident. So the actual crop measure, the readings, I would just emphasize, were taken just around anthesis or flowering time in these particular slides. Here is a figure that's showing some of the bricks data, but it's really emphasizing that bricks is a measure that needs to be integrated over time. So it's not a measure that should be considered as just a one-off measure, and so as expected, we don't have any sort of clear relationship between a single bricks measure and yield. Okay, that's just the message from this particular slide. One thing we were quite interested in is looking at how bricks measures might relate to other things, and particularly nutrients or health status of the leaves of the plant. So in this case, what I'm looking at here is bricks on the x-axis and different elements from the sap analysis at 4 different growth stages. So you can see sap and then the measurement of ammonium nitrate on the left-hand side, and then phosphate on the right-hand side, you can see that the main effect is really perhaps clusters that relate to different growth stages rather than any significant trend within the growth stages. So each point, so if you just look at the green dots, for example, growth stage 30, each point is a trend line. Okay, so there's no clear association there between bricks and sap nutrients, say within a particular timing, but certainly there looks to be a pattern over time. And that's where we might get some value from bricks if we could do repeated measurements over certain periods of time. Just reinforcing this, certainly for potassium, left-hand side, bit of a cloud there, but again, some clustering relating to growth stage. The silicon's interesting is in that we got this sort of clearer trend over time. But again, we need to do some more detailed, more controlled work in the field still on this kind of association. Bricks and other measures. Well, we did a bricks measure at the time of the SAP readings, but that could be a week to 10 days later on the same material. So you can see there's no real apparent strong relationship within a growth stage there. And then we looked at bricks in relation to the SPAD readings on the same material. And again, you can see that certainly over the different growth stages, leaf 4 and in the bottom right of that figure, and then in growth stage 30 at the top left portion of this figure, you can see that there is a negative association based on the growth stage. Now we need to unravel that, because that might in part be due to other factors such as weather influencing bricks measurement itself. And just to finish this this part of the review, we were looking at bricks and leaf disease. So we've got here septoria triticide scores. So on the left-hand axis here, different leaves, and essentially what we can see within in the figure, two growth stages. So the lower scores, these will be from growth stage 37. And then the higher scores, they will be from flowering or anthesis. Okay, so each dot again represents a trend line. So you can see here that we've got an increase in disease over that time. And if anything, it looks as though we've got some higher bricks levels in say leaf 3 on this particular occasion here, compared to the when disease was lower here. But again, whether that's a direct relationship or not, we need to establish. It could be perhaps a weather-related influence here. So quite a lot of sort of thoughts relate to this particular trial. So if we think of the range of nitrogen treatments, so no significant effect on grain yield or grain nitrogen, although the differences were quite large but not significant. The standard ammonium nitrate treatment increased the amount of N offtake. But as I say, we want to look at this a bit further in make a proper sort of cost analysis and nitrogen use efficiency analysis of this in more detail. Foliar N, interestingly, it does maintain a good crop leaf area index and crop N pool. The reason we want to repeat this work is that when we're doing work on these sort of three particular treatments, I do think we need a body of evidence before we can make firm decisions about pros and cons of the standard ammonium nitrate and foliar treatments. So I think we've got a real opportunity to repeat this with a similar design to see whether we get the same effects or not. On bricks, the N application, the type of M didn't alter bricks values or disease levels. In a way, I suppose that's that's quite reassuring, because really we would perhaps like bricks to be a strong indicator of disease levels or changes in nutrition, which is more relevant to the second trial I'll show you in a moment. So we had a significant gradient across the field, which of course was problematic when we're looking at the whole tramline effects. Overall, the leaf area index, SPAD, and nitrogen pool within the measurement or sampling zone was a good indicator. And even early on, were a good predictor of crop biomass and grain yield. So single timing of bricks, really, that's, we need to kind of go beyond that. And certainly between growth stages, bricks may be associated with some trends in nutrients and certainly SPAD, but possibly disease, but we're uncertain about that at the moment. So if we're okay for time, Fiona, should I just move straight on to the nutrients?
We've got a couple of questions, if that's all right, Steve.
No, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
We can bring David into the conversation as well. So just to start off, your key points there say that the foliar nitrogen maintained a high leaf area index and crop end pool, but saw a lower nitrogen offtake. What do you think happened there? Yeah,
it's interesting. It may be the fact that when we're using the nitrogen data, we're taking the full tram line, if you like, and then when we're thinking of the leaf area and other crop measures, we're taking it from that measurement zone. So there's a bit of perhaps a mismatch still. So we might just need to look at this data just in a little bit more detail, because as far as we can say at the moment, overall the methods of the nitrogen application didn't sort of compromise the crop. I was expecting perhaps the foliar nitrogen to perhaps be a more efficient way of the crop using nitrogen, and that's reflected in this high leaf area index within the adjusted treatments. But of course that didn't translate directly into yield. So again, it just may be an artifact of the way that the measurement, the sampling zone, wasn't so representative of the whole field.
And I guess that will come out next year when the trial's repeated.
Yeah, well, there might be some more analysis we can do in the by looking perhaps at some additional photographs and images of the field for this year. But I think we need to think about the way sampling is done. Certainly, we need to get perhaps evidence of any trends early on, so that we can take this sort of thing into account.
And David, obviously you're there every day. Did you notice any differences between the treatments throughout, obviously until we got to yield? Was it noticeable?
To the eye, excuse me, the plots that had the ammonium nitrate both times appeared to be more lush and greener, but I think we'd probably expect that. And even though I haven't used ammonium nitrate here in the farm for a few years now, you still kind of think, well, maybe it'll yield more. But it didn't seem to. I think the other factor we've got to bear in mind this year is that moisture would have been a fair limiting factor. And Steve's point about not getting any better use of efficiency, maybe the crop just, I mean, I know the crops just ran out of water, so we were harvesting everything about a month earlier than normal. So perhaps we just lost out there because of lack of moisture. I don't know. Certainly that'd be the difference. The north end of the field is more moisture retentive soil, and you could see a big difference in yield on that alone.
And that's not something that's common for Scotland, is it? So maybe next year that will
back to normality next year.
And obviously there was no significant effect on yield between the treatments. How did you find the management and the cost of it? Obviously there's so much more that goes into making management decisions than just what yield you get out at the end. How did you find the different treatments?
It's tricky doing different treatments when you've got your head focused on what you want to do on the rest of the farm, and you've got to remember that you need a couple of tram lines left out to do something different. But the overall, using the foliar, we've kind of got our head around it here, and we're geared up to do it, so it's not an issue. It's quite straightforward from that point of view. So yeah, I think at the start it'd be tricky, but once you get into it, it's just like anything else you learn new. You just get used to it.
And your farm standard, is that entirely liquid?
It's all liquid on the farm. The rest of the farm suites we basically did the farm. We did adjusted model number 2, so we put 80 kilos of nitrogen on as liquid urea in late February, early March, and then we just went ahead from mid-April, I think, from memory, with regular applications of foliar urea along with other trace elements, and it worked. I was pleased with the crops that we got on the rest of the farm, so it seems to be working for us, so we're making it work, shall we say. It'd be nice to get some more detail as time goes on. So I wonder, we'll try and push nitrogen rates lower next year on the rest of the farm, see if we can maintain output.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we can move on to the next trial, Steve. I'll let you carry on with your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Fiona and David. And as David says, one of the key approaches, the philosophy is how can we use this information about the crop to make adjustments, and if possible some downward adjustments. And the nutrient trial here, this takes us a wider perspective in terms of the overall crop management, includes crop protection and nutrients. But this is the trial where there was scope to make adjustments with what we call the tailored crop management. So we had a standard program with fungicides, that's number 2, and then a standard with without fungicide. And then we had what we call the tailored management, and so I suppose these might be the Balboni standards. And here there was opportunity to trim the fertilizer or adjust anything according to measurements that we made during the season, and we did make some adjustments, downward adjustments to nitrogen, for example. And then number 4, well, we can perhaps have a look at this in a bit more detail later, but this is our kind of biology in a bag, or bugs in a mug type approach. And so again, it's just looking at something a little bit different at the tramline scale. Okay. So similar to before, here's the layouts for the different tram lines. So again, it's replicated. It's in 2 adjacent fields, and I'll show you a picture actually, and the yield map in a moment. So this is the randomization that we used, again the same tram line widths there. And I've just got the yield map here, and again the measurement zone that was made in this kind of approximately 100 meter, 120 meter sort of transect along the tram lines and across the tram lines. What you can actually see here, a difference between this particular trial and the nitrogen one, the measurement zone was far more representative of the tram line as a whole. Okay, and that's going to come through in the results that we see in a moment. And just to say, we were asking Will before about climate and influences on the crop growth and development. Well, what was interesting about this field, it was a south-facing, a slight sort of south-facing slope, and so from early spring up to about flowering, the crop here, the same variety, was always ahead of the nitrogen trial. So here's an image. I've just flipped the yield map around in this particular slide, but you can see now looking south towards the Firth of Forth, and so this is tramline 3. Okay, so on to the results. So here we've had across our 4 treatments here on the x-axis, certainly was the significant influence here of the standards and the plus fungicide relative to the tailored agronomy. Now, the difference there, it's sort of a ton or more, but when we factor in some of the other farm bench data, sort of the cost analysis, then we might get a different picture from this. But certainly the standard and the full fungicide stood out in terms of being higher yield here, and that's true whether I used a yield estimate from the measurement zone or from the tram line as a whole. Looking at the grain nitrogen here, we've had in the upper picture here, and then the grain in offtake here. Yeah, these are non-significant differences across. It's very interesting here that the fact that the tailored agronomy, you know, held up with a relatively high grain N and also grain N offtake. So this is really quite an interesting point, because here we were actually using less nitrogen overall in those particular tram lines. So once we work out the nitrogen use efficiencies, you know, I'm hoping we're actually going to be thinking of something that's really going to a much more efficient fertilizer use system in those particular tram lines. So again, similar types of figures here, just looking at the time course. So the left-hand side, we've got the leaf area index here. So you can actually see here that the standards with fungicide, certainly kind of late on and coming into April and May, is one of the higher levels in terms of leaf area index. So each dot is a tram line. So the pair of tram lines there. For the standard. And what was noticeable, and it's particularly in one of the tailored tram lines, was that the leaf area was seemed lower, and the coloration, it was paler. So you can see that here in the red and the green dots. When we looked at the SPAD units, although there was no significant difference among the treatments, you can see some of these low values in that tram line that looked paler for much of the season. So no significant difference between treatments within each stage, but across the growth stages, then we did have differences in the SPAD meter readings. So the crop nitrogen pool, and bricks units. So again, this is from the measurement zone, the sampling zone. We can see here that there is a bit of differentiation between the standards and the tailoreds, and that's largely driven by the difference in leaf area there. So remember that the crop N pool is the product of leaf area and the SPAD reading. The bricks readings are really quite tight when we look within a growth stage, and so there's no significant difference between the treatments. But you can see that if we looked at differences between growth stages, then we do get some variation. In terms of disease, as I showed before, we've got the different treatments here, the different coloured symbols. And again, I've changed the size of the dots so we can see each of the symbols. But essentially, what you can see here that with the fungicide in the standards, we've got the lower levels of septoria. Okay, so we've got higher levels of septoria evidence in the standard without fungicides and to some extent in the tailored agronomy as well. And same for yellow rust here. So we're keeping well, it's a low level of rust compared to the year before, but there is some difference here between the standard in these in this orangey sort of color and the treatment without, or the tramline without fungicide. Again, just looking now at relationships between the different measurements and the measurement of grain yield. So on the left-hand side, across the full tram line, and then on the right-hand side, with the measurement zone and an estimate of yield from that measurement zone. And so you can see the measurement zone, sampling zone was pretty representative of the full tram line, and we've got this sort of evidence of a good association between leaf area and yield. So that's actually quite a gives us quite a lot of encouragement, because we can actually go further back into the crop's growth stages and still get patterns like this. What we want to be able to do is to be a bit more subtle than this and actually think about the health status at each of these preceding stages. Just for completeness, I've got the SPAD and the MPOR measures again. So again, yield as the full tram line on the left-hand side, and then the yield estimated from the management zone, or sorry, the measurement zone. And again, we've got this association between SPAD and the MPOR and grain yield. So each dot, again, in this case, is a particular tram line. Here on bricks, so it's really kind of reinforcing the point here that that with bricks, a single measure, a spot measure, is something that we shouldn't treat in isolation unless we're linking it very specifically in with other measures, very precise measures at that time. So a spot measure doesn't relate to the yield potential of that crop. It may well be that we change a protocol so that we look at bricks over the different stages, which is data that we have, and then we can then see if that is an indicator of subsequent disease presence, or nitrogen use, or yield itself. And here again with bricks, and just looking at some of the SAP analysis, some of the nutrients from that analysis carried out in a commercial lab. So the bricks units on the x-axis, and then the ammonium, nitrogen, and then we've got phosphate again. Slightly different patterns, but we tend to get clusters that relate to growth stages, say the 4 growth stages, rather than trends within a growth stage. So really, we could say at this time, we couldn't have much confidence in relating changes in bricks to a nutrient variation within the growth stage itself. But to really answer that point, to really address that, we probably need to do a much more intensive sampling to see if we can tease out more in terms of any relationship that might exist. Just to complete this comparison here, we've got potassium and bricks units, again, clusters. This association here looks a little bit different to the nitrogen story, where it was a bit of a cloud, but here we've got sort of distinct clusters here. And then again with silicon, we seem to have this this pattern where the higher bricks was associated, and the lower bricks was associated with the higher and lower levels of silicon. But again, we need to do something a bit more controlled to see whether these are genuine relationships or not. And just for an addition, I just thought I'd put these two in, which for sodium and magnesium, because they were ones where the clusters certainly stretched out a bit in relation to the bricks units that we scored. Yeah, bricks, and then the measurement that was made in the lab that did the SAP analysis. Again, this is really emphasizing that if you are doing bricks measurements, you could do that in the field. And then we've actually found that if we take the sample back to the lab and do the measurement immediately, we actually get the same value. But if you delay bricks, you know, by sending it away to a lab and getting a measure a week or 2 weeks later, then that certainly the relationship breaks down. SPAD and bricks here, perhaps not as convincing, with the growth stage 31 information here being kind of somewhat in the middle. But again, we were aware that certainly bricks units themselves can be influenced by other factors such as the changing weather conditions. And just for completeness here, this kind of rather busy looking slide where I've adjusted the size of the dots again, it's just looking at bricks units on the x-axis and Septoria Fideaceae on the left-hand side and yellow rust on the right-hand side. So different levels there. So the lower levels, say in Septoria here on the left-hand side, and then rust on the right-hand side. These would just be the earlier stages. So if anything here, it looks as though we've got perhaps a trend where as yellow rust is increasing, for example, we've got some higher levels of bricks there. But again, that may well be a weather influence. Obviously, conditions being very different at flowering time compared to what they were a bit earlier at growth stage 39. So another kind of busy slide with some of the main results here. So the tailored agronomy, we had a reduction in yield, but not actually in grain nitrogen or in offtake. And I think what's encouraging here is I'm anticipating we get an improvement in nitrogen use efficiency. So when we've pulled together all of the input data, the farm bench data, I'm expecting that we will get a good story about improving efficiency as well as maintaining a decent level of production. So that will come out in subsequent analysis. So the tailored agronomy overall, certainly from the measurement zone sampling area, had smaller leaf area and crop nitrogen pool, but certainly didn't vary in SPAD or bricks values significantly. So again, when we get all the farm bench data added onto this, we'll do a bit more of a robust analysis on the economics and efficiency. The sampling zone, yeah, we're very comfortable that this is representative of the full tram line, which is very encouraging here. And again, some of the key measures were pretty good indicators of grain yield. And then just on bricks, the last bullet points here, again, we're thinking of how we use this particular measurement. Certainly between growth stages, we seem to have some trends, but we need to just see whether that is something that stands up year to year. But within a growth stage, there's no evidence at the moment that bricks is associated with other features of the crop's health status. But I think we probably need to do increase the density of the sampling to actually kind of tease this out to see whether there are any relationships that we can use in management or not. So for the next year, the coming year, so we want to continue to develop crop measures as indicators of health and yield potential. And the reason for using some of these crop measures, such as leaf area and SPAD readings, is that they are things we can measure remotely. And I think this is where I'd like to see the work going now, to try to think about how we use remote sequencing technology to help get more representative sampling done. So we hope to continue to amend protocols, certainly with clearer guidance on how we adjust spatially nutrients and nitrogen. And I think really crucially now is to undertake much more control, much more representative work on bricks and SPAD as measures of health and disease. Again, working within the tram lines or different parts of the tram lines. And of course, measuring to get as early information really about any emerging sort of trends or gradients in the tram lines. Yes, so thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve. We'll bring David and Will into the conversation as well for any questions. Again, please do pop them in the chat if you've got any questions, and if you haven't already put your basis and the rosto details in there, please do so we can get you registered for points. So David, you use bricks across as a farm standard, don't you? Sorry, I don't know if that's my sound. How do you think that compares to what you're seeing elsewhere on the farm?
We try and use bricks across the farm, but I'm probably learning what Steve's learned, is that it's very variable. You know, time of day, finding the time to get around certain bits, and whether it's cloudy or not so cloudy. So I'm struggling to expand it as a tool. You kind of end up using it just as on one block of a crop and say, right, well, that just has to be the measure, because getting around everywhere just takes too much time. But it'd be good if we could find a way to refine that and make it more practical from my point of view.
Will, have you had an experience with using bricks on any of the trials or work that you do?
No, we haven't actually. No, it's something that I think we've discussed in the past on that lower managed input trial, but we haven't actually entirely incorporated it. It'd be quite interesting to, having seen what Steve presented, and obviously David, your experience, to potentially use that this season, just to see if we, again, it's more data to put into the pool about what are the outcomes of using it.
I think it's just adding to that the tools that farmers can use out on the farm, just to get an indication of what's going to happen, what treatments to do, help that decision support. So I'm just seeing the question here. David, could you see treatment differences throughout the year again with the tram lines?
Yes, there were differences. You could see the tailored. We struggled a bit with the tailored inputs again, getting results back quick enough from the lab to be able to make an informed judgment. But that's, the labs have upped the game for next year, and we're learning too. So it's all a bit new in that respect. So you could start to see differences where we lag behind a little bit sometimes. Keeping ahead of the job is a bit trickier. But yeah, there were, and the fungicide, you saw it in the yield. The full fungicide program did retain its green leaf longer throughout the season. It was visibly notable.
And what's your approach to fungicide? Oh, sorry, Steve, you go.
No, I think the point about the turnaround time with labs, and I think that is a key issue here, and you know, it can take the quickest is probably a week. And it can be 2 weeks, and that a lot of that is also posting the samples, and you know, and getting things done, particularly if they go to services that might be in Europe, for example, where some of the labs are based. But so we need to think of ways we can speed that up. But at the moment, there aren't. I can't see any sort of gadgets that can enable us to do this in the field directly, like the sap reading. So it may well be that in the short term we are relying more on the SPAD and the bricks type measure. That, you know, if we can at least associate them with some of the sap and the nutrient readings, that might be a step forward.
And David, in terms of fungicides across the farm, what's your policy generally?
We don't use very much. Wheat got 1 fungicide this year at T2, and that was it. And no other crops got a fungicide this year, and we were happy with the results. As I said earlier, it was all about moisture this year, and chucking more money at it for us on the sandy loam soil here wasn't going to add value in terms of increasing yield. So yeah, we're aiming at ideally to get to 0 fungicide if we can, but we're not so blinkered that we won't reach for them if we feel we have to. Yellow rust appears to be the one that we struggle with the most, which was indeed the reason that we had to use a fungicide on wheat this year.
Yeah.
But we have been using biology as well, and we seem to be getting somewhere with that. Hence why we introduced it into this trial this year to see if it, you know, was it actually making a difference in the measurements too.
So how long have you been using biology, David?
We've been playing around with it for 3-4 years now, but it's a minefield out there. You know, everybody's trying to sell you something and make a bit of money out of it, and we're trying to spend as little as we can and cut corners and brew our own stuff at home as well. So there's a huge amount to learn. Maybe they're all the same. Maybe they all do the same job. They put a different label on the can and we get sold it. I don't know, but we're happy with the results that we're getting elsewhere. That's for sure. We're meeting the quality standards that we need for our malting barley and our milling oats. Nobody's complaining that we're getting disease, and the yields we're happy. So
in the journey of adding more biology into the management, has that been, you've seen a reduce in disease or reducing need for fungicides, or has it been nutrition you've been able to amend? What impact has that
had? We've basically just kept the plants clean and healthy. Yeah. I think it's a combination. It's a bit unfair because in the trial we want to look at trials by their very nature want to vary one thing, and then you can make a measure as to what's working and what doesn't work. Whereas on the farm we have a combination of lots of things. We graze our winter cereals with sheep, and we use biology, and we use lots of trace elements, and we think the whole lot comes together and produces a nice outcome for us as a business. I think trying to tease them, and we do the foliar nitrogen as well, of course, on the winter cereals. When you try and tease them apart as to get a result with varying one individual, it seems a lot trickier. I wonder if it all just has to come together to everything's doing a little bit, and that's what gets you the result in the end, perhaps.
Yeah, Will, it might be a question for Brian, but I'll ask in case you're able to answer. Do you know what the nutrition program was for the managed low inputs trial? With any micronutrients added, any biology, anything else?
I do, yeah. Give me 1 second. So why is that unavailable? So sorry, give me 2 seconds. I will find it. Micronutrients, there was some of the plots received more than others. So wait for this to load up there. Yeah, so my understanding is, generally speaking, Brian, I think a bit like Dave, likes to use micronutrients where required based on experience. He does struggle with boron, which he is my understanding. So he often, well, quite often is adding boron, in particular T1 and the T2 on the managed low of that boron at the T1. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, we lost your sound a little bit there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so boron is often a problem for Brian. I think he's determined that through testing. In terms of the rest of the nutrition, okay, this is not enjoying itself. He cut back a little bit last year in terms of nitrogen, but nothing significant. You know, he's been fairly pragmatic across the farm on the whole. That's not very deterministic. Sorry, so fertilizing. Right. So the answer is no. I don't have that information.
That's fine. We can
no,
actually,
no. Turns out I don't have that information. No, sorry.
We're all in suspense then. We can add that to the results pages when we get that information from Brian. So looking at the time, I will draw that to a close. So if we could click onto the next slide, please, Christian. Thank you very much. Oh, I've lost it. There we go. So this is the third webinar out of 4. So next week will be the final webinar for this series, and that's at the same time. So that's 12:30 until 2. The recordings for all of the previous webinars can be found online, and this one will be uploaded within the next couple of days. The easiest way to find it is you can have a look on our website, or you can just Google Strategic Cereal Farm Results Harvest 22, and all of them will come up there. It's probably the easiest way to find things. Next slide, please, Christian. We are currently recruiting for another strategic cereal farm host. So we are recruiting in either the West Midlands, Wales, or East Anglia. My email address is on the screen there, or if you click to the next slide, the details for your local knowledge exchange manager are on the slide there. So if you've got any questions about becoming a strategic farm host, please do let us know. I'm sure David, Brian, and David Blacker and David Miller will also be happy to honestly answer some questions. So please do have a look online for the recruitment information there. And that just leaves me to say thank you to our speakers. Thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully you can join us next week. Thank you very much.